This happened back in 2017 during a solo camping trip I took in Washington. I had just finished grad school, and the stress of final exams, job applications, and just life in general had taken its toll on me. A friend of mine had mentioned a secluded spot deep in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, far from any major hiking trails or campgrounds. It sounded perfect, exactly what I needed to reset. I packed up my gear, left my phone in the car, something I often did when I wanted a full disconnect, and headed into the woods. The forest was thick, and the trail I was following wasn't marked at all. It was more of a deer path, narrow and faint, weaving through towering pines and dense ferns. As I hiked further in, the forest canopy grew thicker, blocking out more of the afternoon light, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp, cooler than in the open, and had that rich, earthy smell of moss and decaying leaves. About 2 hours into the hike, the path became almost non-existent. I had to rely more on my sense of direction than any visible trail markers. The forest seemed ancient here, fallen trees covered in moss, roots gnarled and twisted as if the forest had grown around them for centuries. It was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I found a small clearing, just big enough to pitch my tent, and decided it would be my campsite for the night. After setting up camp, I gathered some firewood and settled down to enjoy the quiet. Dusk was falling, and the forest seemed to grow even quieter, save for the occasional bird call or the distant howl of a coyote. I felt more at peace than I had in months, just me and the wilderness. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, letting the crackling of the wood lull me into a relaxed state. But then, just as the last light was fading from the sky, I heard something strange, a faint rustling like something moving through the brush nearby. I listened closely, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. Figuring it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, I brushed it off. The woods were full of life, after all. A few hours later, after the fire had died down, I crawled into my tent, exhausted from the hike and the long day. I had just started to drift off when I heard it again. The same rustling, but this time it was much closer. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was heavier, more deliberate, like something moving on two legs. I froze, every sense on high alert, straining to hear anything else. My first thought was a bear, but then I remembered that this area wasn't known for bears, and there hadn't been any sightings in this part of the forest for years. The sound stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to stay perfectly still, the thin fabric of the tent between me and whatever was out there. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours, the silence almost suffocating. Just as I started to think it had moved on, I heard a soft, almost human-like whistle. It wasn't a bird or any animal I'd ever heard. It was a slow, melodic sound, rising and falling, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I grabbed the knife I kept in my pack, gripping it tightly as I tried to calm myself down. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to come inside. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, just enough to peer outside. The fire was out, and the clearing was dark, the trees casting long shadows across the campsite. But there, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw it, something standing between the trees. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, its body partially hidden in the shadows, but its eyes, those I could see clearly. They were glowing, reflecting the faint moonlight like a predator's eyes. It was watching me. I ducked back into the tent, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Running seemed like a bad idea. I was miles from anyone or anything, and I had no idea what this thing was or how fast it could move. I sat there, knife in hand, listening, waiting. The whistle came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something moving through the underbrush. It was circling the campsite. My mind raced with thoughts of what this could be. Some kind of forest spirit, an animal I didn't recognize, or something far worse. Hours passed, but it felt like days. Eventually the sounds stopped, and the forest fell silent once again. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid to close my eyes to even move. As soon as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, keeping an eye on the tree line the entire time. The hike back was tense. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest, which had felt so peaceful and inviting the day before, now felt hostile, like it was watching me, waiting for something. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again or hear that eerie whistle. But the hike back was uneventful, and by the time I reached my car, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. Who would believe me? A giant creature watching me in the middle of the forest, whistling like a human? It sounded ridiculous. But the memory of those glowing eyes, that haunting whistle, it stayed with me. Weeks later, I started looking into local legends, stories of the forest, trying to find an explanation. That's when I came across stories of the Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore said to be a malevolent spirit that roams the forests, preying on humans. The more I read, the more I became convinced that's what I had encountered. The stories matched my experience: its tall, humanoid shape, its glowing eyes, and the strange, almost human sounds it made. The Wendigo is known for mimicking human voices to lure its victims deeper into the woods. I don't know for sure if that's what I saw, but I haven't been back to that forest since, and I doubt I ever will. Some places are best left alone. Whatever it was, it wanted me to stay, and I wasn't about to find out what would happen if I did. Story the end.
Story number 2.
My family used to take annual summer trips to the Smoky Mountains, specifically a little campsite near Cades Cove, Tennessee. We would load up the car with our camping gear, snacks, and enough supplies to last us a week in the wilderness. It was a tradition, and one that I looked forward to every year. The campgrounds were beautiful, nestled between towering trees, mountains that touched the sky, and creeks that ran clear as glass. It was the perfect place to escape from the world and make memories with friends and family. Every year, a group of families we knew would also camp at the same spot. Our families were close, like a big, chaotic mix of cousins and best friends. My dad and his longtime buddy, Rick, were the unofficial camp leaders. They always had a way of making things fun, and one of their favorite traditions was taking the kids on what they called a critter hunt. The idea was simple. We'd head into the woods at night, armed with flashlights, and go searching for all sorts of mysterious creatures that were supposedly lurking out there. We believed it. Every year, they'd come up with a new creature. One year, it was the Night Stalker, some kind of nocturnal predator that hunted kids who wandered too far from the group. Another year, it was the Whisperer, a ghostly figure that could be heard calling your name if you were quiet enough. But the one that stuck with me the most was the year they told us about the Hollow Man. I was 10 years old. The trip started off like usual. Lots of fun during the day with hiking, fishing, and swimming in the nearby creek. But as soon as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, my dad and Rick started telling the story of the Hollow Man. According to them, he was a creature that lived deep in the woods, a thing not quite human, not quite animal. The way they described him, the Hollow Man had no real face, just a blank expanse of skin where his features should be. They said he was impossibly tall, with long arms and legs that stretched too far, like a puppet made out of sticks. He was always watching, waiting for kids who strayed too far from their campsites. As usual, the kids, myself included, were terrified but thrilled. We all knew deep down that it was just a story, a way to freak us out, but that didn't stop the excitement from bubbling up as they announced that later that night, we were going on a Hollow Man hunt. By the time the sky had fully darkened, we were ready. All the kids grabbed flashlights, and a few of the braver ones, like me and my best friend Jess, even carried little pocket knives our dads had given us for protection. The adults had done their job well. We were fully convinced that we might actually run into the Hollow Man. Rick said he'd heard something strange the night before, some kind of weird screeching coming from the woods, and that we should be extra careful tonight. We set off into the trees, my dad leading the way with Rick just behind him. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice every little crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. Our flashlights cast long shadows that danced across the trunks of the trees, and I remember feeling like something was watching us, just out of reach, hidden behind the dark curtain of the woods. After walking for a while, Rick suddenly stopped. He held up his hand, motioning for everyone to stay still. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all froze, straining our ears. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, off in the distance, There was a sound, soft at first, like the wind, but slowly growing louder. It was a strange, low hum, almost like someone was singing, but with no melody. Just an endless, droning noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. The younger kids started to get nervous. One of the smaller boys, Timmy, tugged on his sister's arm and whispered that he wanted to go back. Jess, standing next to me, squeezed my hand. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was just as spooked as I was. My dad and Rick exchanged glances, their eyes wide with the thrill of the hunt, and then my dad said, "Stay close, everyone. We're getting closer." We continued walking, the strange hum growing louder as we went. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be all around us. And then, just ahead, the beam of Rick's flashlight hit something. There, standing between two trees, was a figure. It was tall, taller than anyone should be. Its limbs were too long, stretching unnaturally like the branches of the trees around it. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach drop and my legs go weak, was its face, or rather, its lack of one. Just like my dad and Rick had described, it had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over its skull. For a moment, everything was still. The figure didn't move, and neither did we. I remember the silence being deafening, the kind that makes your ears ring. And then, without warning, the figure took a step toward us. That was enough to send the group into chaos. The younger kids screamed and bolted back toward the camp, dropping their flashlights as they ran. Jess and I were frozen in place, our eyes locked on the figure as it took another step, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the fear it was causing. My dad shouted for everyone to stay calm, but I could hear the panic in his voice too. Rick grabbed one of the fallen flashlights and shined it directly at the figure. But it didn't stop. It just kept moving, one slow step at a time. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, my dad grabbed me by the arm and pulled me back, snapping me out of my trance. "Come on," he yelled, and we started running, following the others back toward the camp. We didn't stop until we reached the clearing, where the campfire was still burning. My heart was pounding and I was out of breath, but all I could think about was the figure in the woods. What had I just seen? Was it real? Or was it some elaborate prank my dad and Rick had cooked up to scare us? When we finally calmed down, Rick and my dad tried to laugh it off. They said it was all part of the game, that the Hollow Man wasn't real, and that what we'd seen was probably just a shadow, maybe a trick of the light. But I wasn't so sure. Jess and I talked about it for the rest of the night, and we both agreed that what we saw wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching us. The image of that tall, faceless figure haunted me, and I kept hearing that strange, droning hum in my head, like it was calling out to me. The rest of the trip went by without incident. My dad and Rick never brought up the Hollow Man again, and neither did I. But every now and then, when I'm in the woods, I get that same eerie feeling, like something is watching me from just beyond the trees. And sometimes, if I listen closely enough, I can still hear that low hum, like a distant song, carried on the wind. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe my dad and Rick were behind the whole thing, and they've just never admitted it. But deep down, I don't think that's true. I think the Hollow Man, or whatever it was, is real. And I think he's still out there waiting for the next group of kids to wander too far into the woods. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I lived with my wife and daughter in a remote cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia for nearly a decade. It was a life of simplicity, of isolation, of quiet contentment. The nearest town was a good 20 miles away, and we made the trip infrequently, preferring the stillness of the forest to the bustle of people. It wasn't that we were recluses. We simply valued the peace that came with the mountains, and we learned to thrive in that isolation. Our cabin, nestled between tall oak and pine trees, was self-sufficient. We grew our own vegetables in a modest garden, hunted the local wildlife, and kept a small flock of chickens for eggs. My wife homeschooled our daughter, and the three of us spent our days working together, enjoying the serenity of nature. Like the others who lived scattered throughout the mountains, we rarely saw our neighbors, though we knew they were there. Every now and then we'd trade supplies, share stories, or lend a hand when needed. One winter evening, as the snow began to fall softly on the trees, I sat by the fireplace reading an old book, my wife knitting beside me. Our daughter had gone to bed early, tired from a day of helping us prepare the cabin for the cold months ahead. It was a peaceful night, the kind I had come to cherish. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Suddenly I heard a distant sound, faint but distinct, a low, guttural growl. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I set my book down and looked over at my wife, who had paused her knitting and was staring at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and stood up, moving toward the window. I pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything through the falling snow. The growling had stopped, but a sense of unease settled over me. "Probably just a coyote," I said, though even I wasn't convinced. I knew the sounds of the animals in these mountains, and this didn't quite fit. We tried to go back to our routine, but something felt off. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the woods. I slept fitfully, waking at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, I ventured outside to check on the chickens and our small woodpile. The snow had covered everything in a thick white blanket, and it was eerily silent, save for the crunching of my boots in the snow. As I approached the chicken coop, I stopped in my tracks. There in the snow were massive footprints. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, much too large to be a wolf or a bear, and they had an odd, elongated shape almost like a person's, but far too wide and long. I knelt down to get a better look and felt a chill run down my spine. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. The footprints led away from the chicken coop and into the dense forest. I followed them for a few feet, but stopped when I realized they went deeper into the woods than I was comfortable going alone. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet, and I quickly turned back, my heart pounding. I told my wife about the footprints, and though she tried to dismiss it, I could see the worry in her eyes. We both knew these mountains well, and there was something about those tracks that didn't sit right. That night, as we sat by the fire again, the feeling of being watched returned. This time it was stronger, more oppressive. The growling from the previous night had not returned, but the silence was just as unnerving. We kept the curtains drawn, trying to block out the outside world, but the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. It was around midnight when we heard it again. A slow, deliberate sound, something scratching against the outside of the cabin. It started at one end and moved all the way around, as if something was circling us. My wife grabbed my arm, her face pale. "What is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I grabbed my rifle, the one I kept loaded for hunting, and moved to the front door. I slowly unlocked it and pulled it open just a crack, peering out into the night. The snow was falling harder now and visibility was low, but there was no mistaking the figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, taller than any man I had ever seen, and thin, almost gaunt. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it stood completely still, watching the cabin. Its eyes, like glowing embers, bored into me, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my body. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away as quickly as I could. My wife was standing in the middle of the room, clutching our daughter, who had woken up and was crying softly. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. But we didn't leave. Where would we go? The storm had picked up, and the roads were impassable. We were trapped, at least for the night. The scratching continued throughout the night, but I didn't open the door again. I kept the rifle in my hands, sitting by the fire, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. When morning finally came, I ventured outside again, though my legs felt weak and my mind was racing. The snow had covered any trace of the strange figure, but the footprints from the previous day were still there, leading into the woods. Over the next few days, the unease in the cabin grew. The scratching sounds continued every night, and though we never saw the figure again, we could feel its presence, watching, waiting. I tried to stay calm for my family's sake, but inside I was terrified. I didn't know what we were dealing with, and I had no idea how to protect us from it. One afternoon, I decided to walk to one of our closest neighbors, an old man named Elijah, who had lived in the mountains his entire life. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be him. I told my wife to stay inside and lock the doors, then set off through the snow, following the narrow trail that led to Elijah's cabin. The hike was grueling, made worse by the constant feeling that something was watching me. Every now and then, I would stop and look around, but there was nothing there, just the silent, snow-covered trees. When I finally arrived at Elijah's cabin, I was out of breath and on edge. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, the old man answered. He took one look at me and frowned. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't have to say anything. He could see it in my face. Elijah invited me inside, and over a cup of coffee, he told me about the creature. He called it the Watcher, an old legend passed down through the generations in these mountains. According to the stories, the Watcher was a spirit of the forest, neither good nor evil, but ancient and powerful. It only appeared to those who had disturbed the natural balance of the land, and once it had its sights set on you, it wouldn't leave until it had taken what it wanted. "What does it want?" I asked, my voice trembling. Elijah shook his head. "No one knows. Some say it wants to reclaim the land, others say it wants a life, but whatever it is, it won't stop until it's satisfied." I left Elijah's cabin more terrified than when I had arrived. His words haunted me the entire way back to my own cabin, and when I finally walked through the door, I felt as though a weight had settled on my chest. I didn't tell my wife what Elijah had said. I didn't want to scare her any more than she already was. That night, the scratching was louder, more insistent. It circled the cabin over and over, and the oppressive feeling of being watched grew unbearable. My wife and daughter clung to each other, and I sat by the door with my rifle, waiting for something to break through. But nothing ever did. We left the mountains a few weeks later, abandoning the cabin we had called home for nearly a decade. I couldn't live with the fear any longer, and I couldn't put my family through it either. We moved to a small town on the outskirts of the mountains, close enough to still see the peaks, but far enough away that I could sleep at night without hearing the scratching at the walls. I never saw the Watcher again, but I know it's still out there, waiting in the woods for someone else to disturb its ancient home. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Every summer, my family would spend a week in the mountains of northern Georgia, camping with our friends, the Miltons. The spot we visited was a secluded place just outside of a small town called Blue Ridge, and it became tradition for us to all pile into the family SUVs, drive up the winding mountain roads, and settle into the wilderness. For as long as I can remember, my dad and Mr. Milton had this annual ritual that they called the night hunt. It was their way of entertaining us kids, claiming we were hunting an elusive creature that lived deep in the Georgia woods, something that only came out at night. We'd all gather around the fire, and they'd spin stories about this creature, which they called the night screecher. According to them, the night screecher was part bird, part wildcat, and entirely terrifying. It would let out a long, piercing scream that echoed through the trees and would snatch up anything or anyone who wandered too far away from camp. It could climb trees as fast as a squirrel, they said, and you could tell it was nearby when the forest went completely silent. Of course, we were kids, so we bought it hook, line, and sinker every year. My sister, Haley, and I were always the most excited, probably because we were the oldest, and we wanted to prove we were brave enough to face the night screecher head-on. The year this story takes place, I was 10 years old, and Haley was 12. The Milton kids, Chris and Emma, were also with us. Chris was my age, and Emma was younger, maybe 7 or 8 at the time. We had arrived at the campsite on the second to last day of our trip, and the anticipation was already building for that night's hunt. My dad and Mr. Milton were going all out this year, dropping hints that they'd heard the screecher's call the night before, just outside the campsite, in the dense brush that lined the forest. We were all huddled around the campfire, listening intently as my dad described hearing scratching sounds on the trees, something big moving just beyond the tree line. His voice was low, like he was afraid of spooking it, and every now and then, he'd glance over his shoulder at the dark forest behind him, playing up the tension. Haley squeezed my arm, and I could tell she was nervous, but there was no way either of us were going to back out. That night, just after the sun dipped behind the mountains, my dad and Mr. Milton gathered us kids for the hunt. All right, my dad said, holding a flashlight under his chin, casting eerie shadows across his face. Tonight's the night. I can feel it. We're going to catch a glimpse of the night screecher. Mr. Milton chimed in. It was close last night. I think we scared it off, but tonight, it's different. Tonight, I've got a good feeling. They passed out a few flashlights to us kids, even though we were all pretty sure they were just setting us up for a prank. Still, we were excited. Haley carried a big stick she'd found earlier that day, and Chris, ever the dramatic one, had fashioned a spear out of a branch and a sharp rock. We felt ready for anything. As we set off into the woods, the moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy of trees. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were our footsteps crunching on the forest floor and the occasional whispered conversation between us kids. Mr. Milton walked ahead holding his flashlight high while my dad hung back with us, telling us to stay close. Keep your eyes open, he said. The screecher is a master of camouflage. We wandered through the woods for about 20 minutes, with nothing out of the ordinary happening when suddenly Mr. Milton stopped dead in his tracks. Did you hear that? He whispered, spinning his flashlight toward the trees. All of us froze, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. Then we heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Haley tightened her grip on my arm, and I felt my heart start to race. My dad motioned for us to stay quiet, and we all stood still, listening. The rustling got louder, closer, and then there was a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from all directions at once. My stomach dropped. This was new. My dad and Mr. Milton were good at their pranks, but they'd never done sound effects like this before. I glanced up at my dad, expecting to see that mischievous grin he always had when he was pulling one over on us, but his face was serious. He looked uneasy. Before I could ask him what was going on, there was a loud crash in the bushes ahead, and something bolted out of the shadows. It moved so fast that all I caught was a glimpse, a flash of dark, matted fur and long, spindly limbs. It darted across the path and disappeared into the trees on the other side. Every muscle in my body tensed. It was too big to be a deer or a coyote, too fast to be a bear. My dad's flashlight beam swung wildly, trying to catch it in the light, but it was gone. Mr. Milton swore under his breath, something he never did in front of us kids, and I could tell he was shaken. "What the hell was that?" Chris whispered, his voice trembling. None of us answered. We just stood there, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. My dad turned to us, his expression serious. "Okay, guys, time to head back to camp," he said, his voice steady, but I could hear the edge in it. He wasn't playing anymore. We turned and started walking back the way we came, moving faster than we had before. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing watching us from the trees. But the forest was still again, as if whatever had been there had vanished into thin air. After what felt like forever, we finally reached the clearing near the campsite, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We gathered around the fire, and my dad and Mr. Milton exchanged a glance that I couldn't quite read. They were trying to play it cool for our sake, but I could tell they were rattled too. "What do you think it was?" Haley asked, her voice small. She was gripping her stick so tightly, her knuckles were white. "I don't know," my dad said slowly, "but I think it's best if we stick close to camp for the rest of the night." We spent the rest of the evening huddled around the campfire, trying to laugh off what had just happened, but none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there in the woods. Eventually, we all went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to every creak and rustle outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a low, mournful wail, like an animal in pain. My heart started pounding again, and I sat up, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the woods, the same direction where we'd seen that thing earlier. I didn't wake anyone. I just sat there, listening, my pulse racing. The wailing went on for what felt like hours, echoing through the trees before it finally faded into silence. The next morning, I told my dad what I'd heard. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me not to worry about it. But I could tell he was bothered. None of us mentioned the night screecher again for the rest of the trip, And when we packed up to leave, there was a sense of relief hanging over all of us, like we were glad to be getting out of there. Years later, I still think about that night. I've looked up every kind of animal native to Georgia, trying to figure out what we might have seen or heard, but nothing matches. I've heard coyotes and foxes and even mountain lions, but none of them sound like what I heard that night. Whatever it wasn't normal. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I catch myself listening for that wail again, and every now and then, I swear I hear it. Faint, distant, but there. Watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The Hunted. It was in the deep woods of rural Montana where I, alongside my wife Ellen and our 3 children, had lived for nearly a decade. Our cabin was nestled in a dense forest, miles from any town or paved road. A small, winding dirt path was the only connection to the outside world. In those years, we had grown accustomed to the seclusion and silence of the wilderness. The isolation was our refuge. We raised chickens, had a small garden, and occasionally hunted game to sustain ourselves. Our nearest neighbors lived a few miles away, spread out across the forest, but we kept in touch, trading goods, sharing meals, and coming together for holidays or celebrations were common. There was a mutual understanding between us that living in such a remote area required cooperation. Yet, the unspoken rule was that we also respected each other's privacy. The nights in the forest had always been peaceful, but a few months ago that began to change. It started on a night not much different from the others. I had just finished cleaning my rifle after a day of hunting with my oldest son, Caleb. Ellen had already gone to bed, and the younger 2, Emma and Noah, were fast asleep in their rooms. The only sound in the house was the faint creaking of wood from the fireplace's dying embers. I sat in my chair near the window, reading a worn copy of a mystery novel when I heard a low, rumbling growl from outside. At first, I thought it was a wolf, but the sound was too deep. It was more guttural, primal. I stood up and peered out the window. In the moonlight, I could make out the vague silhouette of something large moving through the tree line, just beyond our yard. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my rifle. Quietly, I crept outside, feeling the cool night air hit my skin as I scanned the area. But whatever it was, it had already disappeared into the darkness. I convinced myself it was just a bear wandering too close to the cabin and went back inside. But something about the sound gnawed at me, deep down. It didn't sit right. The next day, I told Ellen about it, but we brushed it off as there was little we could do. Bears were common in the area, and it wasn't unusual for one to pass through every now and then. A week passed before things escalated. One evening, Ellen came running into the cabin, breathless. She had been in the garden picking vegetables for dinner when she heard something in the woods. "It was close, Peter," she said, her voice shaking. "It was like something was watching me. I could feel it." I took her inside and tried to calm her down, but her fear seemed genuine. I decided to stay outside for a while, pacing around the perimeter of the house, rifle in hand. The woods were unusually quiet that night. No rustling of leaves, no calls of the owls we had grown so used to. Only the wind whistled through the trees, cold and eerie. As the days wore on, both Ellen and I began noticing small, strange things around the property. Footprints in the dirt that didn't match any animal we knew, the livestock behaving erratically, and that ever-present feeling of being watched. At night, the forest grew unnaturally still, as if something out there was waiting. I spoke to John, our closest neighbor, during one of my rare trips into town. He was an old trapper, weathered and tough. When I mentioned the strange occurrences, he narrowed his eyes. "Stay vigilant," he warned. "There's things out here that don't belong in this world. I've seen them in my time, heard stories from the old folks around here." I tried to press him for more, but John didn't say much else. I left the conversation feeling unsettled but unsure of what to believe. The rational side of me wanted to dismiss it, but something about John's tone had shaken me. The following weeks were a haze of anxiety. Ellen and I kept the kids inside more often, claiming it was just for safety. But it was more than that. We felt the dread growing, a dark weight that hung over our home. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late. The kids were in bed, and Ellen was reading by the fire while I cleaned my hunting gear. The familiar scratching noise caught my attention first, like claws scraping against the wood outside the cabin. It was soft, barely audible at first, but it grew louder, circling the house. Ellen looked at me, wide-eyed, and I immediately grabbed my rifle. I moved to the front door and cautiously opened it, stepping outside into the cool night air. The sky was overcast, and the moonlight barely broke through the clouds. But in the faint light, I saw it, something standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, much taller than any man, and its body seemed contorted, hunched over. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, staring directly at me. I froze, my mind racing. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the sheer presence of it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't bring myself to raise the rifle. I don't know if it was fear or something else, but in that moment, I felt completely powerless. Suddenly, the creature turned and vanished into the woods, moving silently and quickly, like a shadow. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where it had been. When I finally went back inside, Ellen could tell from my face that something was very wrong. The next day, I went back to John's cabin, desperate for answers. This time, I didn't mince words. I told him everything, described the creature, and asked him what he knew. John didn't look surprised. He simply nodded as if he had expected it all along. "You've seen it then," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's not a bear or a wolf. That thing, it's old, older than these woods. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't want us here." I asked him what I should do, how we could protect ourselves. But all he said was, "Leave. If it's shown itself to you, it won't stop. You need to leave." I returned home that evening, troubled and unsure of what to do. We couldn't just pack up and leave. This was our home, the life we had built for our family. But the fear was growing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that John was right. That night, the scratching came again. But this time it was louder, more aggressive. Ellen and I stayed up, sitting in the living room, listening as the sound moved around the cabin. The kids slept soundly in their rooms, oblivious to the terror that was creeping closer. At one point, the noise stopped suddenly. I stood up, gripping my rifle tightly, and moved to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. The creature was standing just a few feet away, its grotesque form illuminated by the dim light from the cabin. Its body was twisted and elongated, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. But the worst part was its eyes, those glowing, inhuman eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Without thinking, I fired a shot through the window. The sound echoed through the trees, and the creature let out a low, guttural growl before disappearing into the darkness once again. I knew then that we couldn't stay. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. We packed our things the next day, leaving behind the life we had known for so long. It's been years since that night, and we've never returned to the cabin. I still don't know what we saw, and part of me hopes I never will. But the memory haunts me, a reminder of the things that lurk in the dark places of the world, waiting for the moment when we least expect them. Story the end.